Present.
Amy Levy? Here.
Greg Schneider.
Present.
All members are present in the boardroom.
Thank you so much. Before we move approval of the minutes, I just want to welcome Dr. Anderson. We're so excited to have you on board and at policy, and Attorney Baran, it's really great to meet you. He is not on camera, but our interim superintendent, Dr. Anderson, is present. So you may hear his voice from time to time providing some critical input. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to see you. With that being said, before I ask for a motion to approve the minutes, there was just one small thing. Ms. Shope, with respect to the renumbering of policy going from point 1 to rule 1, et cetera, I think it went from 1 through 5, it repeatedly said that Levy requested, and if we could just make it clear that that was a committee decision to make that change, that would be great. Okay, thank you so much.
And then point of order, could we approve the agenda?
Oh, yes, thank you. Keep me together here. So let me back up to C. I got excited and ahead of myself. Is there a motion to approve the agenda?
So moved.
Second.
All right, there's a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
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 All right, that motion passes unanimously. Thank you, Ms. Shope. Okay, is there a motion to approve the minutes as adjusted?
So moved.
All right, there's a motion and a second to approve the minutes from our July meeting as adjusted. Is there any additional discussion?
So if you want to talk.
Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
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 All right, that motion passes unanimously. So that brings us to our policies for this evening. Dr. Anderson, what I usually do is yield the floor to my colleagues first. If there's anything that I see that hasn't already been discussed, I will pick up at the end. But if at any point you just kind of signal me, and we will definitely yield the floor. So we are going to begin with policy 850 and then move on to rule 850 policy 850, Rule 1, before we entertain a motion to pass on to the full board. We'll begin with that first page of 850. Board Member Schneider, I'll yield the floor to you first. Any questions or adjustments?
I like the edits that were presented, but I would like to keep number 1 here, even though it is covered similarly in policy 852. I think it would be important for clarity to leave it in this policy.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Board Member Anderson, same question. Any questions or edits for that first page? Actually, the only page.
I don't have anything else to add.
Okay. All right, go with me, committee. So the policy begins with students, staff members, or facilities of the school shall not be used for advertising or promoting the interest of any community or non-school agency or organization except as otherwise provided. And when we last discussed this at our June 1st meeting, it was my understanding we were going to restructure that. I would love to hear feedback. I'm slightly uneasy about starting the policy off with "we don't do this except for exceptions" when our next policy that we'll review, there's a whole policy about how we do this. So that seems very awkward to me. But we do usually have introductory statements for our policy. I would like it framed in a way that acknowledges like our schools are for educating our children. It is not our intent to kind of bombard them with some type of framing of what our schools are for, and then move into anything that's outside of this needs to be approved, instead of saying we don't do this when we have a whole policy about how we do it. Did my explanation of that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So before we get to verbiage around that, so Attorney Baran, if you could kind of be thinking about that, we'll come back and address that initial clause. Board Member Schneider, I have no problem with keeping that number 1. I'm fine with that. Board Member Anderson, does that work for you? Okay. Now my concern with number 2, yeah, please, sir.
One thing that, in taking a look at the policy, one thing that you might want to take a look at is on that line you read, except as otherwise provided, you might actually put that wording in, so people don't have to look to see, well, where was it otherwise provided, they would actually have that. Because I didn't see, and it may be in a different policy, but I didn't see it either in this or the rule, what the exceptions were. So that if there are exceptions, if you place them right in the policy for when it is acceptable, then people don't have to wonder.
No, that's really good feedback, and I would like to see some wording, Attorney Baran, maybe except as provided in policy 852, which we're also going to review tonight, because that's the policy of how we can do distribution of non-school related materials to students. So Attorney Barand, if you could kind of keep that framing in there, instead of us being broad, except as otherwise provided, if we could shift that possibly to except as outlined in policy 852. And we can also cross-reference that at the end. So with number 2, the use of students for distributing non-school materials in the community. So that's one thing. Or for soliciting funds through sales campaigns to finance extracurricular activities shall be discouraged. So we don't specify, and I think it may be implied, and we can kind of discuss if we need to be specific, that this is for school authorized or for authorized district activities, because it doesn't just have to be athletic. Because without saying that, my initial thought is it doesn't have anything to do with us. So students distributing non-school materials in the community. It's not our stuff and it's not in our buildings. And then that second one, soliciting funds for extracurricular activities, unless that we specify that they're school authorized, again, that's not our purview, is the way that I'm reading it. And then to say it should be discouraged, again, it feels very contradictory to me, because we have fundraisers all the time. Actually, policy 664, cash in buildings, talks about how we handle funds procured from fundraising. So if someone could share from the administration kind of the thought behind that, to why we would say it's discouraged, but it happens all the time. I just don't want us to be in conflict with our policy. And Monica, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have anything to add, you just come on up to the mic and yep. Yeah, absolutely. Do other board members have feedback on that? Yeah, Dr. Anderson, please.
Well, one of the things that I would make is also to change the word extracurricular to co-curricular.
Okay.
Because extracurricular usually implies athletics.
Yeah.
And you have so many co-curriculars, music, drama, an assortment of clubs that may be raising different funds. And it should be clear that, the rule is the same for all organizations throughout the district.
Okay. I actually was not aware of that distinction between extracurricular and co-curricular. Do you advise that we kind of spell out what co-curricular means? Because my edit just simply said authorized district activities, because again, it's not just athletics, it's, athletics and activities.
Right, and you could use it as, various district activities. It's just that I've noticed in the past that when the word extracurricular is used, people associate that with athletics.
Yeah.
And you really wanted something broader. And co-curricular is at least a term that most people associate with all activities within a school.
Okay.
So athletics plus the other activities that happen that are non-athletic in nature.
No, I'm absolutely fine. Do any board members object to that with us listing it as co-curricular? Thank you for providing that. Do we need to, okay, so are we comfortable with that line, the solicitation of funds through sale campaigns are discouraged? And again, I'm kind of challenged by that because we have a whole process for how we approve it.
I mean, I would like to change that in some way because, kids are doing fundraisers all the time, so.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just contemplate. We're going to have an opportunity to use co-curricular in lieu of extracurricular. I really like that. But what if we start at number 2 with any fundraising project which involves students, families, and or staff of the district, and then I included for, or we could just change that to staff of the district for co-curricular activities must be approved by the superintendent or chief of communications, and you see all of the things there. Is everyone okay with us starting number 2 with any fundraising project and then going to the end? And then making sure that we specify after staff of the district for co-curricular activities. So one, does anyone have an issue with that? Okay. And then 2, Ms. Shope, do I need to repeat anything? So far. Okay, thank you so much. All right, so that brings us to number 3. So the question that I wrote next is, okay, so students shall not be solicited on, in or about school premises by any individual, organization, or organized group seeking to raise funds for any purpose. That happens. So I'm wondering, and the things need to be approved. So it's not that the items haven't been approved, but those things do happen. Ms. Christopa, maybe you could help us with this. Is there a published list somewhere? Because further down in the policies we'll review, one of the not requirements, one of the responsibilities of the superintendent is to review the list.
And I'm going to have to check on that. If
Okay.
there is, it would be housed in our finance and accounting department.
Okay.
So I'll check on that and make a note.
Thank
for
you so
Mary Lee.
much. So I guess it goes back to, we don't want to be contradictory in our policy. Attorney Barand, is there a legal definition of a solicited on? Or could you provide context so we can make sure we're understanding that correctly?
I would understand that to mean that requests shall not be made of students directly on school premises
Okay,
by
As it-
outside organizations.
thank you. See, and this says by any individual or organized group seeking to raise funds. And I'm not saying this is horrible, but as a parent, I know this happens. We have penny wars, the National Junior Honor Society collects for the Humane Society and other things. And again, I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I just don't want us to contradict our policy. Yeah, and it even goes on, nor shall teachers permit such campaigns or drives within their classrooms unless approved. And so, and I would like feedback. It sounds like for me, I perceive it as we start off by describing something negative and then saying we're not going to do this except for these isolated situations. Dr. Anderson, please.
Well, I think one of the things you might want to ask yourself is this what you really believe? Because, I mean, I've been in many school districts and they have like jump rope for heart, or they'll have, they will have other things where they raise money. You mentioned, for like humanitarian causes. Are you telling people that you're discouraging these? Because that's the way it reads now. You're going to permit them if it's approved by the superintendent or chief of communications and marketing. But I mean, first, is that what you believe? Because if it is, then I would say leave the wording in. But if you say, it's all right for students to do jump rope for heart and, other, humanitarian causes, then maybe you want to rewrite the language to say, in these cases, we support it, but in other cases, we don't.
Thank you for that context. And I am okay, and I would like to hear if others feel differently. I'm fine with those things happening. I don't see anything wrong with them. What if we adjusted number 3 to say students shall not be solicited on, in or about school premises by the individuals or organized groups seeking, my apologies. I'm thinking through this as I'm reading it as I'm thinking. How about individual or organized groups seeking to raise funds must have approval by the superintendent or chief. That way it keeps it clean, and I trust the judgment of our administration that they wouldn't have something predatory happening. Yes.
What you might have it read is, without prior approval, students shall not be solicited on. So put the prior approval first so people know that if it is, it has to be approved in advance.
And it might just be me, but reading solicited upon, that just feels very predatory. And again, I like Jump Rope for Heart. I used to participate in it. So are committee members comfortable with individual or organized groups seeking to raise funds must have prior approval by the superintendent or chief of communication, and we need to include or designee for the superintendent, or chief of communications and marketing.
I'm okay with that.
Okay, Board Member Anderson. All right. Ms. Shope, do you need me to repeat anything? Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. All right, and then that will bring us, Dr. Anderson, just for context, if we have kind of a bundle of policies, like a policy and then multiple rules, we usually go through all of them and make our adjustments and then approve them to move on to the full board. So Attorney Baran, do you need a little bit more time for adjusting the opener on policy 850? Should we move on to Rule 1?
I have proposed language.
Oh, perfect. I would love, yes.
So my proposed language would be the intent of the school district is primarily fill in the blank, the education of students. Nevertheless, there are times when certain information is appropriately distributed in or through the schools. The specific criteria for information that may be distributed are explained in Board Policy 252. However, the following activities shall be discouraged, and finish that sentence.
I love that, same for that. Because the way we've rewritten those questions, we took that negative frame out. So I love everything you just said. I would omit the following activities shall be discouraged because of the edits we just made. Would you email that? Is everyone else okay with the language that Attorney Baran proposed?
That sounds good.
Okay. Thank you so much for doing that on the fly. I appreciate you. Will you email that to Ms. Shope so she can incorporate that into, and I believe it's policy 852.
Sorry.
No,
Yes, you're
no
right.
problem at all. So Ms. Shope, if you can keep an eye out for that email and then let us know if you don't get it by the time we'll pause. All right. Thank you, everyone. So that brings us to policy 850, Rule 1. It's just over a page, so we'll just take the whole policy. Board Member Schneider, any questions or edits?
Since we just changed policy 850 to be more positive, we probably need to go through Rule 1 and do the same editing here.
Yes.
But based on what was here on the page, under the general guidelines, I don't like the word should be there.
Yeah.
I think it needs to be must. Let's not give them the option. Either they have to do it or they don't have to do it.
Right.
So I think it should be must.
All right. Before I yield the floor to you, Board Member Anderson, same question. Any questions, edits, concerns?
No, I like the things proposed by Board Member Schneider.
Okay. So let's just start from the top and make sure it's congruent with the policy. So I would actually propose that we remove that first clause that begins with students shall not be requested to participate in any organized campaign to raise funds for any purpose, because that happens, and we just covered that in the policy that pertains to this rule. So if we started the policy with contests and activities where sponsors are outside, I'm fine with that. I just believe it gives appropriate context. With the general rule, that first, I love that you said that because I highlighted should and I put optional, question mark. Our PTA, PTO, and PTSA, is that current language for our parent-teacher groups? No. Help us, Ms. Christopel. And I love the smirk, by the way.
We use the term PTA.
Okay, and it's just PTA. Perfect. All right, so if we could just say when groups such as PTA use the school, I absolutely agree. It should be must. Perfect. And then my only question is, and I get that this is school specific, but before we're telling people that authorization needs to be made by the superintendent and the chief of staff with the executive director of business services. I think that language is used later. And so I just want to make sure that we're consistent. And then also later in policy, which we'll get to tonight, it says that the approvals go to central office, and then central office gives their approval or denial to the building president. So I just don't want us to contradict ourselves. So if the PTA, what is the intention behind it? Is it okay to reach out to, go ahead, Dr. Anderson.
Well, you can finish. I just had two comments. One for clarification is you've used in the past, and in fact, in the policy you just went through, it went the superintendent or the chief of communication. Here it has building principal. So how will they, how would you differentiate? Why wouldn't you keep the same with the superintendent or the chief of communications and marketing? And then the second, the statement about before Weekly Reader and other student newspapers are ordered, the consent of the principal shall be obtained. What does that have to do with this policy at all?
Okay, so I didn't pay him to say that. Literally in my notes, I said, is this a part of a curriculum set? It seems like a purchasing issue that has absolutely nothing. We'll get to that. And yes, I agree. Yes, I think we need to be consistent about how things are approved and messaging to people who are seeking approval. Now, with that being said, if it's there, I don't want to overlook it. Is there an issue with us removing the building principal and keeping it consistent? Approval needs to be sought through either the superintendent or the chief of communications and marketing.
One thing to add then, so if we do that, we'll have to change the staff responsibilities because it lists the responsibilities of the print, because it says must submit all fundraising, for teachers, it says submit all requests for fundraising and contests to the building principal before any other actions are taken.
Right, and we'll get to that. I just want us to make sure we're clear on the frame, and then we can make any adjustments as we move down the policy. But thank you for pointing that out. So Dr. Anderson, is that going to, in your opinion and leaning on your experience, is that going to ruffle feathers to take the building principal out of that loop?
What I have found in the past is that if building principals have a question about fundraising, I'm the first person they call to say, Dr. Anderson, can we do this? So they're usually looking. So it would be my past experience that if building principals have a question, they will contact, and they would just as soon probably, in many times, have central office make that decision.
Okay.
So they don't have to try to weigh between competing bodies.
Perfect. I didn't want to step in something if we could avoid it. Ms. Kostropol, help me with this. Later on in the policy, so sometimes our policy says to get approval, the superintendent and the chief of communications and marketing, and then it loops in, and I forget the language, is but with the executive director of business services. So another framing, because in the previous policy it says or, so the superintendent or the chief of communication and marketing. Let's understand our frame. Is it fine to do or? Okay. Do we need to loop in that approval process through policy, the executive director of business services?
I would say yes, and that was a good question to ask. And let me tell you where it really becomes important when they're doing fundraisers and then they decide to do a GoFundMe page on their own, on a personal Facebook page, and it comes back. We prefer all fundraising to be on our class community page and not use outside sources. So in my context, I'm always in communication right now with the director of finance. So it is important to loop them in. And I think with the superintendent, sometimes they have a much, much busier schedule, and that I can take those calls and can handle it. So perhaps, and then certainly in conjunction with the director of finance or ED.
Perfect.
And
So, yeah.
I would concur is that I think that you can use or, because usually if there's something that's going to be, if it's a fairly easy decision, you don't need, but if it's more complicated, then those individuals are going to talk, to make the determination of what they think is the best in that particular situation. So I think or is fine.
Perfect. So Ms. Shope, could you bounce back to the previous policy? Because we want to keep our framing consistent. So with respect to approval, it's going to be the superintendent or designee or the chief of communications and marketing. And I love the language you used. Was it in conjunction with? Okay. In conjunction with the executive director of business services or designee. Do you need me to repeat it? Okay. So anytime approval comes up for either of those policies, even if I accidentally say something slightly different, please keep me together and know that's the framing we're using. All right. Thank you so much. Okay, so to recap, we're going to omit that first paragraph. We will start the policy with contest and activities. Our general guideline will omit PTO and PTSA, leaving only PTA, and then that should will be changed to must. All right. The weekly reader. I have no idea why that's in the policy. Does anyone want to fight? Yes, Ms. Shope, please.
Just verifying, though, we are removing the building principal
Yes.
and then just leaving, and then that approval, that's where you're saying it should be everybody that we just talked about.
Yes.
Got it.
Yep. Thank
Okay.
you so much for
Yep.
getting clarity.
Yep.
Is anyone willing to fight for weekly reader? All right, we're going to remove that. Okay. Parent guardian solicitation by students for special fundraising drives shall be discouraged. So my question is, will it be stopped? And do we have additional context for why that appears? Dr. Anderson?
My question is, what does it mean? I mean, one of the things with policies is if the language isn't clear so people know what it means, it's hard for them to follow it. And when I read this, I honestly didn't know what it meant. So we should either rewrite it to make it clear or take it out.
All right, I'm going to save you a trip to the mic, hopefully. You let me know how I do. The most recent example I'll have is that Madison Nicole back there was part of our Destination Imagination team that went to global finals. So that was parents and guardians fundraising for a school event to get our kids to global finals, et cetera. And there was the GoFundMe versus Classmunity. So so that would be an instance, and I'm sure there are others, where parents and guardians would help fundraise for a school-sponsored event that may not be technically initiated within the school building. I am comfortable with parents, guardians, or community members need to follow that same process. They need to submit something in writing to the superintendent or the chief of communications, and I'm messing up. Chief of communications and marketing, and I say we just keep everyone on the same process. All right. So that second bullet point, I would like for us to say parents/guardians or community members, because it may be, an interested community member that really wants to support our students, which we appreciate, should follow the same approval process outlined in policy 850. So parents/guardians or community members must follow the approval process outlined in policy 850. Any edits to that? Ms. Shope, do you need me to repeat anything?
Here's a quick question for you, because in 850,
Yep.
we say like in part 2, it says involving students, families, and or staff. Should we add staff to that also? Because maybe they have kind of a fundraiser idea also.
I could go either way. I yield to the will of the committee, but I think the spirit behind the suggestion is someone outside of the school district. So a parent, a guardian, a community member. Where I think of as a staff or building, staff is inside the system that includes them. You're reading that differently?
I mean, if that's the way that you're having it intended to be read, then I'm just fine with leaving it the way it is. But if you're reading it and I was just trying to make sure that we're covering all those bases that could possibly be.
Okay. Yeah, I'm comfortable with staff being covered under policy 850. Board Member Schneider, do you?
I'm comfortable with that.
Okay. All right, now we're going to get to what Board Member Anderson brought up, which I think is important about responsibilities and just making sure they're congruent with the changes that we've made. So the response.
me?
Yes, please.
Before you move on.
Yep.
Just to clarify, with the parent and guardian sentence that you were doing?
Yes.
When you ended with outlined in policy 850, were you ending it there, or then it was supposed to be followed by the, by students for special fundraising drives, or not? Like, was the end of the sentence at the end of outlined in policy 850 and the whole rest of that sentence that was previously there is gone? Am I asking it clearly or not?
No, you're okay. I'm looking at it and processing. Okay, so parents, guardians, or community members must follow the approval process outlined in policy 850. I'm fine with us just leaving it there. Does anyone have a desire to include students for special fundraising drives?
I don't think that's necessary.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think so.
We'll just end it after policy 850, the approval process.
Okay.
Yep, thank you for checking.
Yep, thank you.
No problem. All right, staff responsibilities. So the responsibilities of teachers. Okay, so instead of building principal, we will put superintendent or chief of communications and marketing.
When you're looking at the sentence, the last one, all collections of money and sales of any kind must have the principal's consent. I think that can stay the way it's written, because people collect money for various reasons. And right now, I already think you have a policy that deals with, money in the schools and the process for how to deal with it. So, and that I think a building principal can deal with, because, if they collected it for whatever cause, there's already policy on how that needs to be distributed to the office. So I think that one you can leave the principal in charge. You don't have to move that to superintendent or chief of communications and marketing.
No, I absolutely agree. And the thing there is that if they're following the policy, they'll already have approval from the superintendent of chief of communications. And then once we get to that point, I am going to recommend that we cross-reference policy 664, cash in buildings, because that talks about how to house the cash, et cetera. All right. So next is responsibility of the principals. So I would say once approval, help me with words, not once approval is reached, because that sounds awkward. Once approval is given, I would just move right into that second bullet point. Inform parents/guardians that children under 12 years of age may have written parental permission, and children under 9 years of age must be I don't understand, accompanied by someone 16 years when participating in fundraising events. Okay, that does not happen. We have fundraisers in the elementary schools. They don't have people accompanying them. But I do think that parents, and I think we do a good job of this, of notifying parents that fundraisers are happening. So that informing parents or guardians, I would say inform them that it's happening, but the 12 years must have written parental permission. That doesn't happen. Is there a reason that's in there? So do we need to enforce it or omit it?
Is there any like legal requirements for that to be in there?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay.
Other than the common sense supervision issue, no.
Okay. And then the accompaniment, my experience as a parent, that doesn't happen. I'm not coming to the school so you can participate in a fundraiser. I would like it to say under responsibilities of the principal that once a fundraiser has received approval, that the principal will inform parents and guardians, and whether that's putting it on the school's website, or usually principals do a weekly message, or however, let them do their thing. But I do think it's important for parents to be informed. Ms. Shope, do you need me to repeat that?
I guess I need to know where you land.
Okay, so, and jump in and, yes, Dr. Anderson, go ahead.
I mean, one of the things that I've learned from policies in the past, since we're talking about that one, is you either need to enforce it
Yep.
or you take it out, because if it's
Enforce or omit, yep.
this, if you're only do it part of the time, then you actually leave yourself more open. So if this is what you truly want, then it must be, then I'd say we need to work for enforcement. If you're okay with it's not being enforced, then take it out. But you really can't have it both ways, because if you do sometimes you don't other times, you actually allow yourselves up for more criticism than
Yeah.
putting it one way or the other.
I absolutely agree. Enforce or omit. We need like policy committee T-shirts with that on it. So what I am proposing is that we omit the first bullet point, and then the second one is adjusted to say, once a fundraiser receives approval, and we've already outlined that process, inform parents/guardians. Give me words, of the details of the fundraiser. And I would say leave all of the other stuff out. One, because it doesn't consistently happen. And two, no one's rushed with a compelling argument for why this should be enforced. Okay, everyone on the same page? All right, Ms. Shope, are you good? Yes. Perfect. All right, responsibilities of central office. Review the fundraising activities annually. So what is our current practice? Because they're sent in as they're happening, right? It's not like at the beginning of the year, or maybe it is.
Again, the finance department keeps track of all of that information. So if we could take pause, I could have Wendy send, if that would help. But they do keep track, monitor, and review them annually.
No, perfect. And if you're confirming that that's happening, someone may have interest and they can shoot you an email, but that is not something that needs to happen right now, but I appreciate the offer. I just want confirmation that yes, that is happening, so it's appropriate for that to be in our policy. Now, the question that I had on that second bullet point, review contest request, and then it gives an example, and then it talks about WIAA. I don't think it's like one of these things is not like the other, unless the ticket sales are viewed as a fundraiser, and that's why, because this looks like AD reviewing the request to have the contest. Dr. Anderson?
I would say you should take that out, because it's not the same as a fundraiser. if we do, like if we hold various tournaments, there's a set procedure for how much money the district will get from ticket sales, from, paying the expenses. If you're holding forensics, and I was at one time a forensics coach, there's already a set process in place. That's not a fundraiser. So I really, fundraising policy, I don't think that sentence needs to be in there.
Thank you so much. Attorney Baran?
I'm going back to your parental permission, so you can come back to me
Yes.
when you're done with what
No,
you're
you
doing
go
now.
right ahead.
Go ahead, you said?
Yep, please.
Oh, okay. I just said I was thinking a little bit more about it. Under a FERPA consideration with student privacy, if you're working with a third party, that might be the reason to need parental permission. If student names and records are being disclosed to a fundraising company or agency, that might be an instance in which you do need parental permission.
Okay.
I don't know if you want to incorporate that. I think that would apply to all students, though.
Okay, we're going to put a pin in that. Do not let me leave this rule without addressing that, okay? Thank you so much. All right, I absolutely agree that second bullet point, we should just remove that, and then I'm fine with the third one. Does that make sense for everyone? All right, so we are going to cross-reference, unless there's objection, policy 664, cash in buildings. And then I don't want to get FERPA wrong. So we've done all the things for policy 850 and the rule 1, but I would recommend that we postpone the approval of moving it to the full board for a first reading until we make sure that we're in line with FERPA. Are there any objections to that? All right, so is there a motion to postpone finalizing policy 850 and 850 Rule 1 until our September 7th meeting? And the reason for that is to get clarity around FERPA rules with parental consent with respect to fundraising.
So moved.
Second.
All right, there's a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All right, that motion passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone. That was
Board
re-
Member Levy, can I make one comment? I checked our
Please.
website in all the schools. It's PTO. I was incorrect. So if we could please make note of that, and I've checked all the schools' websites they're referring to.
Thank you
My-
so much.
my fault. Thank you.
No worries at all. We're a team. So, Ms. Shope, if you could change PTA to PTO. Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, that brings us to policy 852, distribution of non-school related materials to schools. So we'll take this one page at a time. Board Member Schneider, any questions, edits for that first page?
I would like to keep item G in this policy. Again, it may be redundant, but it's better to be clear as to what our meaning is than to have to jump to different policies in order to find that information.
Okay, no issue with that. Board Member Anderson, any edits or adjustments for that first page only?
Well, since I mean, I'll like if it comes up, I'll ask questions about this. But like mostly, it's we were talking about having principals like brought into the idea of like fundraiser side of it. Are you thinking possibly the same thing in this case, where we're going to have like it's just going to be a superintendent decision or the chief marketing or communications and marketing?
Yeah, that's why we took the time to establish that frame, and we're going to keep that same frame throughout. So we'll make adjustments as we address it. And
Cool. I just want to make sure.
no problem. Dr. Anderson?
The one question that I have is under procedures 1F. First, I think the support of the LGBTQ, and actually should be plus, clubs in binary and gender fluid. I think that is extremely appropriate, and I think there's resolutions that the board could make. But as far as having it in a policy, it doesn't appear to have any place. When I read the rest of the policy, it doesn't seem to fit. It's there, but, and I agree with the statement, but it doesn't seem to fit in the policy.
Dr. Anderson, we are same page. It's like you're reading my notes. So, all right, I have a few. We will definitely address that in the first page because I agree. Absolutely, I agree with it. We'll get to that. Okay. So my first proposed adjustment is that first paragraph. I'm fine with the edits that are currently made when we get to that last sentence for public school age students. If the information meets the criteria set forth below. So I think 1 should be moved up to that first clause, and then we list those items. Does anyone object to that? Okay. So just for flow and structure, so again, for public school age students, if the information meets the criteria set forth below. And then number 2 will become number 1. Now here's my issue. So it says the person/organization requesting to share the information through electronic means. So it gives them one option, which I'm fine with, but then later it talks about physical flyers, etc. So again, I just want us to be consistent. Was the intention behind that is that we don't want to deal with a whole bunch of flyers that need to be passed out and stuffed in folders, etc.?
Thank you, Board Member Levy. Exactly. Now, there are exceptions when we do take flyers, but there's also an expense when organizations were dropping them off and asking us to make 300, 400, 500 copies. The pandemic certainly showed us, and our Blackboard messaging at 96%, that electronic work. However, I know with the littles, sometimes there would be an opportunity to send a flyer home. So thank you. It's really up to your decision. Most of the work, because we have our community hub and the electronic newsletters with schools in our district, is electronic.
Okay. And I get everyone doesn't do electronic. I'm fine with us saying if an outside organization wants us to share their material, they just need to provide it electronically. Now, the caveat to that, and we can let buildings handle this themselves, because I like that it says they have a contact person. If you want a physical flyer, reach out to that entity, and it's going to be on them to make those copies and get it to you, etc. Does anyone else have a different perspective?
I would like to add that in one of the policies, and I can't name it, if flyers are to be sent home, they need to have a cell phone, a number in which parents can follow up, and/or a website. So many of the organizations will call me and I'll walk them through that, but it's also listed on our website. I apologize for not being able to name the policy, but it is.
No, I think it's in what we're going to cover
Oh,
tonight
great.
because that sounds very familiar. Like there has to be a point of contact. So we'll get to it.
Oh,
You're good.
great. Thank
Yep.
you.
Is there something that I'm missing? Help me with my blind spots. If an outside organization wants us to share information, I'm fine with that. I think that's appropriate. But I think to cut down on a lot of things, making the copies, teachers finding time in the day to stuff those backpacks, et cetera, that should be done electronically. Does someone feel differently? All right, that was my teacher wait time. All right. Okay, perfect. So we'll make that adjustment later when we start talking about physical flyers, but we're going to make the decision that if it's an outside group, we are happy if it meets the criteria to share the information, but we're going to do it through electronic means. All right. Okay, so in C, the program/activity is appropriate and serves public school age children as determined by the chief of communication. So it has all of that, the principal or superintendent. 1, do we want to leave the principal in that loop? I'm fine with it because well, hold on, let me think about this. If the approval needs to go, I changed my mind. If the approval needs to come from the superintendent or designee or the chief of communications and marketing, then they would be making the determination. So to be consistent, we would remove the principal for that. But the larger point I'm making is as determined by. Now hold on to that thought and then look at D, please. Material is not defamatory or insulting to any group or individual. I think we should reproduce that as determined by, just for consistency. All right, yes, Dr. Anderson.
Well, just as the English teacher in me is that since you have Chief of Communications and Marketing capitalized, and in your other policies you have superintendent, or the other one's capitalized, you should be consistent and probably capitalize superintendent. Just as the English teacher to be consistent throughout.
No, I completely support that. And in the spirit of consistency, if we could swap the order of that, the superintendent, is there a reason or designee was taken out? I would be in favor. So superintendent, so the same framing, Ms. Shope, I'm gonna cut down on words, that same framing in the same order, and we'll be consistent. And then F, we support our LGBTQIA plus. Absolutely. I just don't understand why it was placed in this policy. Absolutely true. I just don't think it pertains to this specific policy. And as the things that we just discussed, talking about not defamatory or insulting, those things are going to be caught. So we're not going to do anything that would be against any community of our district. So is everyone okay with omitting F? Okay. And then Board Member Schneider has recommended, which no one has an objection to, that we keep G. All right, last call for edits or adjustments for that first page.
I have a clarification.
Please.
So I just want to clarify, because in our previous policies, we were including the executive director of business services because those were fundraising efforts. This isn't necessarily fundraising. Am I including the?
No, please. Thank you for catching that. Okay. So it's going to be our superintendent or designee or the chief of communications and marketing, and we'll stop it there. Thank you for catching that.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you.
No, thank you. All right. Same format, page 2. Board Member Schneider, any questions or adjustments?
I have none.
Okay. Board Member Anderson, same question.
I have none, and the spot where you said it sounded familiar about the communication is number 3.
Perfect. Thank you for pointing that out. All right, let's start at the top. I have a couple. So that first, so this is still going to be number 2. I'm fine with, with the omissions there. That last part of the sentence, nor does the school district of Beloit support or endorse these programs or activities. So the note I wrote, then why share it? Now, and Attorney Baran, do you help me? I think the spirit of that is we find value in this and we approved it. But if you get to the event or the function that we promoted and it goes left, like that's not on us. So Attorney Barand, help me put that in legalese, because I think that's let me check in. Is that the spirit of what we want to say? Because to me, it sounds ridiculous to say, I sent you this flyer, but we don't support it. Then why did you send me the flyer?
Well, I don't want to speak for the attorney, and I'm sure that she will voice, but one of the things that I've learned in the past is that if you're submitting for outside organizations and you choose one, but you don't choose another, that's when you're going to find yourself in potential, a legal situation. So that's why it's usually either, as it once was put to me, you either open the doors and let everything, or you close the doors and, limit it. Because if you make choices on what you think is appropriate or not, it just leads to more complicated situations. But I'm sure that the attorney is going to give you better wording than I am.
I hear you. My gentle pushback comes from the individuals that we identified to approve are making judgment calls on whether it's appropriate, whether it's in line, with the values and beliefs of the school district of Beloit. So as long as we're consistent, I think we're good. It's not going to be, and I trust our professionals to be professionals. Well, we don't like that group, so we're not going to approve the thing that they're doing. So I think we are going to make choices if we open it up, but I'm sure Attorney Barand is going to keep us out of vulnerable situations with amazing language. So I'm going to yield the floor.
I don't think the language is horrible as written. I think I would follow endorse rather than support or endorse. I would say to Dr. Anderson's point, I think that's the First Amendment limited public forum discussion that we've had before, that in much the same way as your facility rental policy, using the school to distribute literature has to be done even-handedly as to especially controversial issues. And so to the extent that you may get literature that takes one position or the other or targets one group or another, if you're going to allow the literature that leans one way, you have to allow the literature that leans the other way. And again, in the same way as your facility rental policy, if you have objective basis because it's offensive to a group of people, regardless of whom they may be, I think you can choose not to distribute that literature at all. But it would be on the basis that it's offensive or it's inflammatory, whatever, rather than because of the viewpoint that it takes.
Perfect.
And so our decisions have to be viewpoint neutral. For purposes of this point, I think it perhaps is a little bit different in its meaning, and it's more intended to absolve the district, as you said, of responsibility or liability for what may happen at that event. To me, that sits better with the word endorse than support.
I absolutely agree. Is everyone okay with omitting support and just say, nor does the school district of Beloit endorse these programs or activities? Okay.
Would we want to also include that the district does not endorse the organization? Because if you're putting out their material, you may not endorse their programs or activities, but somebody can say, well, they're still sending it out, so they must like this organization.
I am fine with including that clarification, the organization, program or activity. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, the other thing under, so 3, we're not going to have printed brochures or flyers, but if people see the electronic and they feel that they need one, they can use that contact information that board member Anderson pointed out is in number 3, and they can work that out with the other organization, but we won't be making copies and dealing with that. Number 4, is there agencies comes in when before we've been using like persons, groups, or organizations. Is there a difference that we need to be mindful of, or is it just semantics? All right, I'm going to take that silence to it's semantics. Attorney Barand, stop me if that is incorrect. If we go to 4B, to offer scholarship or subsidy fees to low-income students if fees are requested. So I take requested fees as like a donation. So you don't have to, but we accept donations. It would make sense to have that wording if the fees are required. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. So does anyone object to changing requested to required in 4B?
No.
All right. And then that's all I have for that page. So unless there are any other issues, is there a motion to approve policy 852 to move on to the full board for a first reading?
So moved.
Second?
All right, there's a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye.
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 Thank you, everyone. That motion passes unanimously. All right, that brings us to 860, which is a one-pager. Okay, so Board Member Schneider, any questions or edits to policy 860?
I have none.
Okay, Board Member Anderson, same question.
I just find it kind of like, I don't understand why they put like building principal, like in, added from 860 Rule 1, where it says building principals are authorized to post signs at all entrances which direct all visitors to enter at the main entrance and report to the office. I mean,
Oh, that's in Rule 1. Okay, let's just stick to 860 for now, and then we'll jump down to 860 Rule 1.
but it says added from 860 Rule 1.
Oh, okay, yep. I'm sorry, repeat that again, please.
So like in that first part where it just says building principals are authorized to post signs at all entrances, like, I mean, do we have to necessarily say that they have the ability to tell people to report to the main office? Or, I mean,
Okay, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that has already happened. It may be nice to just, I would say omit it or just make people aware that those signs are posted. Ms. Christopo, you go right ahead.
What some of our principals have been running into is having people not want to go through the correct channels and saying, and this could be an issue, maybe not in policy, who are you to tell me that you don't have them posted at your doors? So we want principals to know, hey, I have the authority to post it on all of the doors, any of the windows, in a manner to keep our students safe. But again, I acquiesce to your decision on whether that should be in policy or not.
What you might,
Yeah, go,
excuse me,
please.
what you might put instead of authorized is required. I mean, if you already have it, and if you want to be consistent, then instead of authorized, if you put required, then all of our buildings will have signs directing them to, an entrance. You'll be consistent throughout the district, and there won't be a question about whether or not they should or should not have to be there.
I like that. Does anyone object to that? Okay.
and then my next question is, for all visitors required to check in, sign in, and receive a visitor badge in the front office, should we say via the Raptor system? Or,
I'm fine with leaving it as is because at some point in the future, we might not be using the Raptor system.
or can we like specify like whatever kind of system that we're using? Because, I mean, some people they might refuse to use it for various reasons. And if they are refusing to have that kind of quick check, maybe there's something that they're not telling us why they should be there.
Again, I'm fine with us keeping it broad, and if that's our current practice and they refuse it, then that means they're not interested in entering our buildings. Do you feel differently, Board Member Schneider?
No, I agree with you. I think the check-in process
Yeah.
is to run it through Raptor or whatever program we're using. So I think leaving it that way is fine, generic.
Yeah, but I think you bring up a good point. If someone's refusing, that could be a red flag.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that like it's specified that like if you're not complying with it, then you don't get, if you just throw a stink, then you get let in, but just trying to make sure that's specified.
Yeah, I think that's covered with all visitors are required to check in. So we're covered. All right. I think I may have answered my own question. If we go back to the top, that second row, well, let me just start at the beginning. The Board of Education staff of the Board of Education and the staff of the School District of Beloit welcome members to the community. I love that we're starting with a positive frame. We welcome members of the community and other interested persons to visit our school. And my first thought was, who are these other interested persons that are not community members? But then I'm like, oh, well, we're so amazing. Like if someone wanted to come in and see how we're doing things, to learn, then of course we welcome them and they're going to be vetted and everything is fine. So I just wanted to share that for some apparent reason because I talked myself through it. All right. moving on. I want to keep that. Okay, so therefore, like that first strikeout in red, I'm fine with. The second paragraph that starts with board members are encouraged to visit schools. Somebody help me understand, why would we ever take that? It's part of our board goals. I think it's a good reminder that as our schedules permit, because most of our board members are working during the day, I would like to keep that. And then it moves on. I would omit that second part that's already stricken out. But I'm just bringing it up, just again, to make sure we're understanding and congruent with policy. In their capacity as visitors, however, their authority is limited to that of any other visitor. That's actually not correct, and that's spelled out in policy 150. And it's a moot point because it's already stricken through, but just for the edification of all of the people who are watching at home, policy 150, number 5, briefly states, so it talks about board member powers, et cetera, by visiting and observing the schools of the school district and exercising general supervision over the schools without individuals directing building operations, which is important, and I know all of us are respectful of that, but I just want to make sure that our policy is congruent and not contradicting each other. So that's why I am in support of the remainder of that still being stricken. But I think it's important to keep. Board members are encouraged to visit schools. But I'm fine with like moving that and including it up in the prior paragraph. Does anyone feel differently about that?
Well, one question I just have is, if you already have a board policy that talks about, like the roles and responsibilities of board members and has the visiting of schools in that, then really you don't need it in this policy because it's already in one of your policies that said board members are encouraged to do this. So, I mean, if you have a policy that already says that, then you could put that sentence in, but it wouldn't be necessary because you're not looking at the board member as a visitor. I mean, I always look at a board member as like a staff member visiting. So that I always see a difference that a board member is not really a visitor. You're, the governing entity of the school district. It's just part of your normal assignment to visit schools.
No, I definitely see that point. And with that being said, I am okay with omitting it. Does anyone feel differently? Okay. So if we jump down to continue on that point, where it says add it from 860 Rule 1, all visitors, including all visiting individuals, staff, students, families, volunteer, vendors. I'm not sure why staff or student would be included in visitors, unless they mean to a building that you don't either attend or work in. You're nodding. Okay. Could we clarify that? So all visiting individuals, so staff, and I'm flexible with wording, at buildings other than their home building, staff, we could probably just put that same clause after staff and students. Does that make sense, or does anyone object to that?
Well, actually, you could make it, if you take that out and you just leave it, all visiting individuals must report, then you've made it anybody who visits the building, because you're not talking about staff member. Staff member doesn't visit the building, but anybody coming in is going to report. So You've basically said, look, if you're coming into the building, you're not a normal staff member, you have to check in.
Perfect. So if we could just omit what's in the parentheses, I think that just keeps it clean. And then again, we'll change authorized to required, as we already discussed. If we can go down to number 2, students shall be prohibited from bringing to class friends or relatives not assigned to that class or younger children. So I am suggesting that we not include friends or relatives. And the reason is, I remember back when I was a Purple Knight, I did FBLA, and there was a business camp. And I met and connected with the student from Wauwatosa. And then after camp, we like traded a day with each other. So like I went to school with her, and then she came to school with me. And of course we had prior approval, et cetera. But I could see how, and then even when when I was a student at Beloit Memorial, we had like it was like a big 8 like student cohort, kind of like student council. And we would do are you smiling because I'm dating myself, Mrs. Christoffel? We would do like a student exchange. And I think that it doesn't happen often, but I think there's a lot of value that can be had to that. So I would recommend that we omit that so that the opportunity to do that is there. Now, I couldn't think of a good reason to bring, well, younger children, if you have like shadowing or something like that. So let me just back up. Do we really want to include number 2? Because I was like, well, it makes sense until you get to younger children, but it might be a shadowing program with a mentor-mentee, which I think could be very valuable. Yes.
Well, one thing, I think you already have it covered in the statement because it said approved by the classroom teacher or building principal. So even in your exchange program, you probably, before that student, exchanged with you, you probably had already talked to the teacher or the building principal, is it all right if, person X comes, the approval would already have been made, which this policy allows for. It's just saying that you can't bring them to school unless basically you've had permission from the teacher or the principal.
Okay, and I would love for us to put that positive framing. Thank you for pulling me out of the weeds, Dr. Anderson. I got all nostalgic there. Appreciate that. So students wishing to bring a guest to class must have prior approval by the classroom teacher and the building principal. Is that acceptable? Okay. All right.
That sounds good.
Perfect. And thank you for listening to my fond memories at Beloit Memorial. Ms. Shope, do you need me to repeat any of that? I do not believe so. Okay. Thank you so much. All right. So that moves us to policy 860, Rule 1. No, we were doing 860, but they kind of pulled from 860 Rule 1 and then recommended deletion. So it still exists until we make a motion. A lot of what's in Rule 1 we've already addressed. My concern is number 1, the second bullet point. Parents/guardians of students in that school are welcome to visit the classroom of their child. And then it talks about the building principal or designee, as well as the classroom teacher, must be informed prior to the visit. So 1, I am fine with also including that in the policy and then retiring the Rule 1 if that's the will of the group. Parents should always be welcomed in a classroom where their child is being taught. I feel very strongly about that. I also think that prior notice is encouraged because we don't want to disrupt the educational environment. But I'm just thinking, if my child is having a concern and I need to sit in this morning, I don't want to be barred from doing that because I didn't fill out the paperwork to do and you can't be a distraction. I get all of those things. So I would actually like to keep that, and I'm fine with moving it to policy 860, but I would recommend that it reads parents/guardians of students in that school are welcome to visit the classroom of their child. Prior notice to the teacher and building principal is strongly encouraged because there might be those moments where I need to be in that space with my child. And I don't think we should have, as long as the parent is not being disruptive, that goes without saying, I don't support policy that bars that from happening. I would love to hear how others respond to that.
Well, I would say that I think prior notification should happen because if you're a teacher and someone all of a sudden walks into your classroom, there is no way that it cannot be a disruption because automatically the teacher is going to think, what's happening? what is wrong, and if they thought there was a concern, then it would strongly be encouraged that the parent and the teacher talk about what the concern might be for the child. So I'm not opposed to having the parent watch the child's class, but I do think that there needs to be notification so that when a parent shows up, the teacher is already is aware that the parent's going to show up. So if there needs to be discussion in advance, there's an opportunity for discussion. I just can't, I just see that if someone walks into the classroom, I mean, even the first couple of times I walk in the classroom, people are going to sit there until they realize who I am and what it is. It's going to cause a jolt. So I can only imagine if it's a parent who's walking in, your first thought's going to be, there must be an issue. And you don't want that, because I just think if you notify them in advance, then one, the person is prepared, and if there does need to be a discussion, it allows time for discussion to be had, before the visit takes place.
No, and I absolutely hear you. I just don't agree. And I don't see this as being a regular thing, but if I need to be in a space with my child, I don't think that we should have policy that bars that from, and I get all of the things you just said, but as long as it's not an excessive disruption, and anytime a new person goes into the classroom, that's an automatic disruption. But yeah, I just happen to disagree on that one. Board Member Schneider, and then Board Member Anderson, we'll hear from you.
Well, to be informed prior to the visit could be going to the office and informing the principal of the reason why you are visiting on short notice, and the principal could then notify the teacher that you will be down so that they know. That's still prior approval to me. But I agree that they need to know that it's happening, even if that's a phone call when you're leaving the house or leaving wherever to get there. That's still prior approval or prior notification.
Perfect. So possibly, so we can, and I'm completely comfortable with that. Like somebody needs to give somebody a heads up. And I think the spirit of it, so maybe the strongly encouraged part would be 24 hours notice is strongly encouraged, but we understand there might be exceptions, but that prior notice, I'm with you. Board Member Anderson, and then Dr. Anderson, we'll hear from you.
No, I think there should be kind of a notice to that, to someone at least, so the principal can say, okay, at least that maybe they can take you down there and then kind of help kind of smooth out the kids kind of getting look, there's a new person in here, and trying to figure out who you are, what you're doing, because as soon as they see adult come in, they're do they have some kind of power? Is it a new principal, something? And then that conversation shifts, or whatever they're doing shifts to that individual. So I think that there should be some kind of notice there.
Okay. Yeah. And was your mic? Yep. Go ahead.
And I think the notification, it doesn't have to be 24 hours in advance. I would agree that if you come to the office, which we just went through the policy about checking in, and you want to see it, then that principal can then, either walk the person down to the classroom or can call the teacher and say, I'm bringing down boom, 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 who would like to observe the class for ... That still is notification. So it's not that you have to give a long time, but then the person's not going to be shocked.
Absolutely. And that's actually not possible with the plan we just laid in place. And it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that guests have escorts in the building in many cases. So what about this? If we kept parents/guardians of students in the school district are welcome to visit the classroom of their child. Yep. The building principal or a designee, as well as the classroom teacher, must be informed prior to the visit, and that can happen the day of. And I am fine if we want to retire Rule 1, because the bulk of it has already been included in Policy 860. But if we could, one, not omit that language, and then include it in that section that says added from 860 Rule 1. Is anyone opposed to that? All right. So is there a motion to approve policy 860 as amended to move on to the full board? And also the recommendation to the full board to retire policy 860 rule 1?
So moved.
Second.
All right, there's a motion and a second. Is there any additional discussion? Hearing none, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
All right, that motion passes unanimously. All right, that brings us to our final policy of the evening. Great work, everyone. Policy 860 on the attorney recommendations is that no changes be made. Board Member Schneider, I'll start with you. I'll yield the floor. Do you have any questions or edits?
I do not.
Okay. Board Member Anderson, same question.
I do not.
Okay. I just had a couple questions. So in that first paragraph where it talks about except otherwise provided by board policy, all complaints originating outside the school system. And then if we go down to the second to the last sentence, it says the superintendent, will issue a decision. Now, in all of our specific policies for how investigations work, it's the way I'm reading this is that this is for any complaint that falls outside of those cycles that have already been outlined. So except otherwise provided by the board. So my question is, what is the process for the superintendent comes to a decision? It's not clear on how that decision is distributed. And then it goes into the complainant may request a review by the Board of Education. So to me, we need a sentence to describe, and it could just be an adjustment to what's already there. The superintendent will issue a decision. Does that typically, Attorney Barand, go to the complainant and the complainee?
What I would recommend is that you simply maybe just add some verbiage. I would say the superintendent will issue a written decision within 10 school days. Then there's a time frame in which the person's going to have it. Then once they, have received the decision, if they then want to bring it to the board for further review, you might just put in the sentence, the individual would then have X amount of days to ask for a board review. But that gives you a timeline.
Okay, so my question still remains, if I'm the complainant, I hope I got that right, how will I be notified that this decision is, so the superintendent sends it to the complainant and the complaintee? Is that how it works, Attorney Barand?
Who is the complaintee, as you're referring to?
The person that the
person that-
complaint is about.
Okay.
Did I get those labels correct?
I would say respondent, but
Okay, I can go respondent,
problem.
yes.
I don't know if it's always true that there is another party, and that might be a question to administration. I would certainly say that the decision should be issued directly to the complainant, however the complaint was originally made.
Okay, so if there is a respondent, would it be appropriate to issue that, and I love the written complaint, I love the time frame of 10 days. Is that 10 days of when the complaint was received or when the investigation concluded? I'm assuming when the investigation concluded. Okay, so the superintendent, within 10 days of the conclusion of the investigation, will issue a written decision to the complainant and respondent if applicable. Are we good with that, Attorney Barand?
Yes. The only other thing I would say is that in most of your policies, you do leave some room for the deadlines to be extended if necessary. So,
Okay.
if you are going to put deadlines
How do
in,
you
I would-
recommend we include kind of that that wiggle room, for lack of a better term.
Let me pull up your other policy quick, and I'll tell you.
Okay. Ms. Shope, could we start with that, and then Attorney Barand will let us know if and how we need to adjust it? Do I need to repeat that? Okay, perfect. Okay, so there's that. And then, Dr. Anderson, what time frame do you recommend? So let's say I'm the complainant, I get the decision, I'm not pleased, and the board is not required to review it, but I want to request that the board reviews it. Do you think 10 days is appropriate, or? Okay. So the complainant may request a review by the Board of Education within 10 days of receipt of the written decision. Okay. All right. Ms. Shope, do you need me to repeat anything? No. Okay.
So Board Member Levy, I think the 10 days for requesting review is appropriate.
Okay.
I would say consistent with other policy, I would set your deadline for response from the time that the complaint is received, whether that's 10 days or perhaps 15 days. And then the language that appears specifically in, I'm looking at 113, but it is elsewhere, I believe, as well, is just it may be necessary to extend the timeline in certain circumstances.
Okay, so if
It
we,
does give some examples, but I think that's sufficient here.
perfect. So Ms. Shope, if we could just add, it may be necessary to extend those timelines in certain circumstances. And would that also apply to the complainant wishing to have the hearing before the board? That would apply to both timelines? Or
I
just
would
the
not
decision?
apply it to that timeline. I
Okay.
think you want the time to appeal to the board to be finite.
Perfect. So if we could only include that clause, you're nodding, you got it. All right. Yes, please. Yep. Everyone comfortable with that? Okay. So the final thing that I have for this evening is that next paragraph. Complainants which raise questions as to the desirability or wisdom of a given board policy are appropriate for board consideration. If an alleged complaint merits consideration on policy grounds, the complainant should be invited to address a communication to the board. Do we need to structure a process around that? And the reason I bring it up is that the board recently received an email about a policy that we just finished reviewing with athletics and activities. And so one, I would specify policies are appropriate for the full board. So if it's something that's dealing with policy, my initial thought is that it should come back to the policy committee to address it and then move it to the full board. But then this instance that we have, if it's something that was just reviewed by the full board, and I could just be overthinking this, so committee members, feel free to share that with me. All right, let me back up. My general thought is if it's a policy issue, it needs to come to the policy committee and then be moved on to the full board. Now, since it's something that we just reviewed so recently, it makes sense for me for that to go to the full board. One, do you agree with that framework? And then two, if yes, we can do language around it.
I mean, one thing I would say is that the board as a whole is what passes policy. So the committee works on it. So if a person's complaining about a policy, it must be one that already exists.
Yep.
So then I think it is appropriate for the full board to hear that, so they can discuss, so then a determination can be made whether or not it should go back to the policy committee for revision. But I think it would be important, the board passed the policy, my guess is, from this. Now there's a complaint. The full board should hear what the complaint is, and then the board can determine whether or not they feel it should go back to the policy committee for review.
I love that, and it simplifies what I was explaining, and it works for if it's policy that was reviewed last month or 10 years ago. So what I would recommend that we have is complaints which raise questions as to the desirability or wisdom of a given board policy are appropriate for full board consideration, and then the full board can decide if this matter needs to be referred back to policy committee. Okay, does that capture it? All right, Ms. Shope, do I need to repeat anything? Okay, so what's different than what's already there, except for specifying full board, the full board will decide if the matter should be referred to the policy committee for review. And then that way, that allows policy committee to spend the time doing the research, digging into it, and then it's going to come back to the full board for final approval anyway. All right. Anything else on policy 870? All right. Is there a motion to approve policy 870 as amended to move on to the full board for first reading?
So moved.
Second?
All right, there is a motion and a second. Is there any additional discussion? Please.
So I just want to clarify, if the first sentence is the complaints which raise, and I'm adding the word full board consideration, then the next sentence is going to be that the full board will decide if the matter should be referred to the policy committee for review.
Yes.
Am I keeping the next sentence that says if an alleged complaint merits consideration, or is that sentence being deleted?
You know what we could do? Just keep full board, keep that information, and put that last sentence about the full board will refer, put that at the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to
Everyone
make
okay
sure I
with
was-
that?
Whether or not I needed to delete anything.
No, thank you.
Sure,
Mrs.
thank
Shope.
you.
All right. Any other discussion on 870? All right, all in favor, please say aye.
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 All right, that motion passes unanimously. That completes our policy work for this evening. Thank you, everyone. Our next meeting date happens to be my mother's birthday. So Wednesday, September 7th at 5:30. Is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
Is there any discussion? Hearing none, all in favor, please say aye. Aye.
Aye.
All right, that motion passes unanimously. Thank you, everyone.
All right, have a great evening. I like an hour and a half on the head.